Welcome back to Lunch Hour Live. I'm Sue O'Connell, and we are thrilled to be back again with the folks who are behind American Experience's new production, George W. Bush. It's a two-part documentary, of course, exploring the life and the presidency of the 43rd president of the United States. Now, of course, as you know, this is part of the American Experience's Presidents Series, which, of course, again, is a Peabody Award-winning collection. It includes 16 presidential biographies examining most of the presidents from the 21st century, and George W. Bush is the 17th film in the collection, something to consider as you're online learning, distance learning, or just bored and want to revisit some fun, new, and exciting approaches to our presidents. I'm joined today by Susan Bellows, the acting executive producer of American Experience and senior producer on George W. Bush. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you for being here.
And Barak Goodman, a senior producer for ARC Media, which is the filmmaking team for the documentary. Welcome to you. Thanks for coming on. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I'm preparing to talk to you guys, watching these clips, this tremendous 8-year presidency, and I feel like I had forgotten a lot of stuff that happened. Saddam Hussein, enhanced interrogation, occupying Iraq, surging in Iraq. How do you decide what's important from the 8 years and from the life, which, you know, by any standards, George W. Bush's life was incredibly interesting before he became president. How do you decide what goes in the series?
Well, I think I'm going to jump in first, Barak, just to say that, you know, we've been doing this for a long time, and it's not really just about the events of the presidency. It's very much about this sort of intersection of the man in the office and all of the forces that shaped the man in the office. So it's really a biography in the broad sense. That said, there's no question, I think, once Barak and his team started diving into this, the magnitude of the events and how far-reaching they were and how much they still were influencing the world we lived in today wasn't so much a surprise, Barak, as much as we'd all kind of forgotten a little bit. We were probably a little bit, there was an awful lot of very dense presidency, consequential, as one of our interviewees say.
So how do you pick the signposts to go along? I mean, do you approach it in a chronological fashion, or do you approach it in the significance fashion, or do you let the presidency sort of tell you what's important?
I think that Susan was onto it when she talked about the approach that these films take, and it's very characterological. It's very much about understanding the man and what motivated him, how he made decisions, how he interacted with the people around him. And, you know, like any storytelling, you have to impose a structure. You have to impose sort of dramatic highs and lows. In this case, there is a kind of tragic arc to the George W. Bush presidency. I mean, he comes in almost immediately, faces one of the gravest challenges any president has ever faced, and is singularly unprepared as a president to face that challenge. And it only is over the course of 8 years that he learns, in some ways, how to be a president. And by the time he's figured that out, it's in many ways too late. So that automatically gave us a kind of narrative arc. And then once you have that kind of frame, it's easier to decide what stays in and what stays out, what helps you tell that story and what doesn't.
The series premieres on May 4th, and if you're watching us on Facebook or Twitter, please, you can ask a question. Just put it in the comments and it will make its way to us. You know, the title, Born to a Political Dynasty, Tested by Political Reality. Of course, no president gets to pick things that happen to them, even with their most positive or aggressive or aspirational agenda. Events happen to presidents. And one of the events, obviously, that impacted all of us in such a deep way were the events of 9/11, of course, and the aftermath. I want to show a clip from American Experience's documentary, George W. Bush. We're going to take a look at what happened when Bush and his team heard about what was happening at the World Trade Center.
September 11th unfolded from clear blue skies, perfect cool weather in Florida. And the president went for an early morning jog.
How far did you go altogether?
4.5.
4.5 miles?
I think so. It's very solid.
I went down to get into the president's motorcade, and it was on the ride from the hotel to the elementary school that the first plane hit. I remember Ari turning around in the van and saying, "Michael, do you know anything about a plane hitting the World Trade Center?"
We were just pulling up to the school when the first tower had been hit. He had a quizzical look on his face. Was it bad weather? You know, he was a pilot. Didn't make sense.
Get ready. More. Yes, more. Get ready. Light. Yes, light. Get ready. Light.
While President Bush sat in the Emma Booker Elementary School classroom in Sarasota, Florida, his staff was scrambling for information. At just after 9 a.m., Chief of Staff Andy Card interrupted the reading.
The teacher told the students to take out their books. I whispered into his right ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack."
So I wrote on the back of a yellow legal pad, "Don't say anything yet." I put my back to the press corps and I flashed the card to the president. He made one of those little nods like that.
Thank you, Press. If you can step out the door we came in, please.
Mr. President, are you aware of the reports of the plane crash in New York? And is there anything?
Talk about it later.
Thank you all. You can step out the door we came in.
And then we got the press out of the room where the reading was being done, assembled in the holding room.
Immediately, we have what is commonly called the fog of war.
As the president's on a secure phone, the rest of us are working our phones, trying to figure out what we can figure out, starting to work on a statement for the president to deliver. It was controlled chaos in that room, and it was information gathering under immense, immense pressure.
Certainly brings us right back to that moment. Barak, I'm interested about the context of it. It's hard, I think, for younger people to watch that and not to understand the context of what technology we did and didn't have. I mean, I can't imagine a similar circumstance today where not everyone would know all at once exactly what was happening. And I feel somewhat more sympathetic looking at George W. Bush getting that information in that moment than I did at the time. Like, I almost feel like there was a graciousness to him wanting to finish the event. I'm wondering how that impacts you're making this series when you've got to weigh what you thought, weigh what you know now, and weigh what the world was thinking at the time.
So it's a great observation on your part. I mean, I think one of the real challenges in making these films is that it is recent history. We lived through this, and we've lived through the years since when a lot of caricature has been layered over the history, and a lot of us think of George W. Bush as kind of almost a kind of buffoon or disengaged or sort of a Texas good old boy. And Michael Moore, of course, made an enormous deal of this period where he's sitting in the classroom not doing anything. And one of the opportunities we have with a film like this is to peel all that away, go back to the context of the time, understand what was actually happening. And in that clip you just showed, Ari Fleischer explains that he actually held up a sign: "Don't do anything, stay there, be calm, don't alarm the children." There's a reason that George W. Bush sat there for several minutes, and it wasn't because he was befuddled or didn't know what to do. So this is the opportunity we have in a film like this to really go back and understand the man in a much deeper way. And I think one of the contributions our film can make is really to dispel the caricature of George W. Bush. He was not what Will Ferrell shows him to be in the impression he does, or Vice, the movie, shows him to be. He had problems with engagement with details. We all know that, but he was certainly not someone who was disengaged in general from his own decision making.
Susan, this is the 17th in the series. How does this compare to the other presidential documentaries that American Experience has done, and sometimes in general to the broader efforts?
I would say, we bring the same approach to all of our biographies, as we were describing, that it's very much about trying to understand the context of the times in which this leader grew up in, and try and use their life and their presidency as a lens on the kind of things that that the president often has to encounter to try and help people understand what that office means and how it is shaped by the individual who assumes that office. But I think, for all of these things, we have calculations to make about, when is the timing right to try and step in and tell this story. We don't have a formula, obviously. For the biographies we told, like about A or FDR, they were more decades after those presidencies. We were still able to collect some eyewitnesses, but I would say there were more historians who we had to rely on to tell those stories. With some of the more recent portraits that we've done, this one included Clinton, which Barak also produced for us, George Bush Sr., we were 10 or 15 years out, and we're always trying to find the moment at which we can tell the story where there's enough perspective that we're removed from this political partisanship, perhaps, of the moment, but we can still take advantage of having eyewitness accounts and people who can offer us sort of the breadth of insights onto their personal experiences before they came into the office, but also insights into how they functioned in that office. And we have a large cast to kind of balance all those eyewitness accounts and perspective to create what we hope is going to be a really 360-degree portrait of the individual, but also the challenges he faced as a president.
We're living in a time where, especially most recently, many of our former presidents, were still alive. I don't think there are times in the centuries that we've had as many presidents. Do you ever get feedback? Have you heard from the Clinton camp, or have you heard from the Bush camp about what kind of job they think you did in covering the presidency?
I think sometimes it trickles in by knowing there's not a backlash. I think, I don't know that we would have had all the doors open for you, Barak. We certainly talked about this as you were beginning to line up your interviews. The George W. Bush administration had worked for George Sr. That's a tight-knit community. You can certainly say more to that, Barak, probably.
Well, I will say, first of all, about the Clinton film, we did hear back through channels that they hated it, and that the opponents of Clinton also hated it. So we knew that at that point that we had done a great job, because both the Clinton lovers and the Clinton haters both found fault, and you find that kind of sweet spot in the middle. I have to say about the George W. Bush camp, if you want to call them that they were remarkably open with us. I was impressed by two things. One is their openness and their candor, and two is their loyalty. And you can really judge the character of a president almost through the affection and loyalty he inspires in those around him. And both Clinton and Bush, but even more George W. Bush than Bill Clinton, has a set of people that truly admire him as a human being. And one of the most important things they wanted to get across to us, far more than the details of policy or whatever, was just who this human being is. That he's a remarkable, compassionate, loyal, dedicated human being. And that really made an impression on us. I mean, we wanted to be very critical. We wanted to be very honest about his foibles and shortcomings. But we were convinced by really passionate people that we got close to, who were close to him, that he is a decent and compassionate human being first and foremost. So, and of course,
this isn't just about his presidency, to your point. This is also about his life, and you do spend a good amount of time getting to know a little bit more about what made George W. Bush tick, how he did in school, the approach that he decided to take, his relationship with his dad. Let's take a look at another clip from Born to a Political Dynasty, Tested by Political Reality. It's George W. Bush.
Jenna and Barbara Bush were born in 1981, each named after a grandmother. With a young family to provide for, Bush felt ever more pressured to make a big strike, and ever more frustrated by his repeated failures. His company, some joked, should change its name from Arbusto to Arbusto.
It's very risky. I mean, you can be a millionaire one day and absolutely broke the next day. It was always better to be lucky than good. I mean, let's face it,
he wasn't particularly lucky.
He's ranked, I think, in the 995th biggest oil company in Texas or something like that. At one point he says, I'm all name and no money.
I think his friends and family, when he was nearly 40 years old, were worried about what he was going to do with his life. He drank too much, and he had very little direction.
Feeling lost, Bush began to attend a weekly Bible study session at the suggestion of some friends. The program was called Community Bible Study and was a scriptural boot camp.
He's looking for something, right? He's seeking out direction, meaning, understanding. Religion begins to give him that definition, that path forward.
The oil business was up and down, and there was a kind of spiritual sense in Midland, and an understanding that things go down, but they will go up, and that fundamentally you must have faith. And part of that faith was a Christian faith.
He transitioned from a churchgoer to a Christ follower and wanted to emulate the tenets and teachings of Jesus Christ. And he made a definite transformation there.
Armed with a newfound faith, Bush finally addressed one of his lifelong demons, alcohol. The decisive moment would come after Bush's 40th birthday party.
He woke up hungover. He'd overdone it the night before, and he didn't feel good. And I think Laura told him that he could have behaved better. He just said, I don't need this in my life. It's robbing me of my energy. You know, it's taking too much of my time.
That's a clip from American Experience's newest production, George W. Bush. Susan, I think it's fair to say that every president there are just such extreme reactions to every president, depending on where you're sitting on which side of the aisle or which agenda you're thinking about. How do you approach, especially when it's still fresh? As you noted earlier, we're not that far away from George W. Bush's presidency. How do you approach it with an unbiased eye? What voices do you bring in? Who do you speak to? What's your sort of gut check to make sure that you're presenting it in as factual and as unbiased a method that's appropriate?
I mean, I think Barak touched upon it earlier, but first and foremost, so much of it has to do with the cast of people that you interview. And, you know, I think one of the greatest assets of this film is that it has so many people who were insiders, but we were also very careful, Barak and his team, to balance those inside perspectives with outsiders and journalists who had been extremely close to him for decades. We reached out to the people who were close to him before he even entered political office. We reached out to the people who covered him while he was a governor. Barak and his team reached out to the journalists who did, you know, pretty harsh investigative pieces and who have spent the remaining years analyzing. And so I think through that balance, it's, I think, something like 46 interviews that you did, right, Barak?
At least. Many more off camera, yeah.
And Barak, do you get a sense, we have a question from someone watching on the web, do you get a sense of who in his circle really knew George W. Bush the best?
Well, that's a great question. We purposefully go for those people because there are a lot of people who will claim to know a president. There are a lot of people who will, even people like Dick Cheney or Don Rumsfeld, who you might think would have the best vantage point on a president, often don't. They're often, it's consumed with their own agenda or whatever it is. And it's the people a little bit lower down the chain or the people who are more confidential with the president. For example, his two chiefs of staff, Andy Card and Josh Bolton, we interviewed both of them, remarkably candid with us in every decision, in every meeting. His briefer, his daily briefer, CIA briefer, Mike Morrell, who actually was the liaison between the intelligence agencies and Bush and knew exactly the intelligence he was getting. Those kinds of people who haven't spoken a lot, they don't resort to their talking points. They really are fresh and they are candid. And those are the people we look for when we do a film. And once, if a person is just going to whitewash the past, and we know this from pre-interviewing, and they just kind of go back on the tried and true talking points, we tend not to want to interview him or her. And in this case, we were able to find, as Susan said, a large cast of people who we felt were really open with us. And that's the key to making these films work.
Another one of the historically significant events that happened under the Bush presidency, of course, was the economic crash of 2008. And that obviously is something that we're feeling today as we live through the COVID-19 crisis. And many of us, I never really recovered from that crash myself. And it's interesting to go in and see the decision-making and the conversations that were happening within the presidency at the time. We're going to show another clip from George W. Bush American Experience's latest series.
In this difficult time, I know many Americans are wondering about the security of their finances. Every American should know that the federal government continues to enforce laws and regulations protecting your money.
Bush's Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, realized that his piecemeal efforts to stabilize the financial system were not enough. Confidence in Wall Street banks had shattered, and as lending dried up, businesses across the country faced the very real prospect of bankruptcy.
These big institutions on Wall Street, where money moved with a click of a mouse at the speed of light around the world. If you had another big bank or two having failed, it would have been hard to figure out how to even put the thing back together again. I had visions of food lines, massive unemployment, disasters that were worse than the Great Depression.
Paulson requested an urgent meeting with Bush to deal with the burgeoning crisis. He needed Congress to approve a radical plan to take the toxic assets off banks' balance sheets. He called it the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP.
We knew we needed to get something big. So TARP had to be big enough to create market confidence. And we asked for $700 billion. And the reason we did was we didn't think we could get something with a T in front of it. $1 trillion sounded too much, and $700 billion seemed like about the most we could get.
There are a lot of voices, especially on the Republican side, who said the right thing to do is just, let it go. Let it go. People made bad bets. They have to pay the bills. Let the banks fail. If it's all the banks, let all the banks fail.
Any kind of bailout was deeply antithetical to everything that Republicans generally, and President Bush in particular, believed in. He believed in the market, and he did not come to the presidency to bail out people who made bad bets on mortgage-backed securities.
On September 18th, 2008, Paulson met with Bush. He brought with him the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and together they made their case for a massive government bailout of Wall Street.
Much of it's a blur, but I remember the president, the vice president, Josh, and a whole lot of other people in the Roosevelt room. He asked if this was the worst he'd seen in the markets, and Ben said you'd have to go back to the 1930s to see a situation like that. He then said, is there anything more the Fed can do? And I think that was the critical point in the meeting. And Ben looked him in the eye and said, there's nothing more we can do.
And it's a really clarifying moment for him. And after Paulson leaves and after Bernanke leaves, he goes back to the Oval Office and a couple aides come in after him, and he's just pausing to let this sink in. The words "another Great Depression" are hanging over him at this point. He's in the final year of his presidency. This is what's going to happen? And he says, if there's going to be another Great Depression, you can be damn sure I'm going to be Roosevelt and not Hoover. He is not going to sit there and just hold back.
Eric, I can't imagine being president of the United States and being in my last year of my second term and having all of these legacy challenges and then have this crash happen. Do you ever feel any sympathy for the presidents that we're covering? I mean, they're human beings, and they certainly are invested in not only doing a good job, but being remembered well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this was a presidency bookended by two of the greatest challenges a 20th century president, a 21st century president has ever faced. So what's interesting, though, about this president was the arc, as I mentioned before. And I think, by this time in his presidency, he's learned humility, which is a very underestimated feature, quality of a president. And I think what's very interesting in the 8 years is to see how he starts with this very hubristic kind of point of view, and he ends up very humble. And that almost parallels the course of his life, which also, in which he also had to kind of embrace humility to get past the kind of years of, drunkenness and partying and really kind of surrender himself to his faith and to a kind of different way of being. And it's paralleled in his presidency. And I think that really is the takeaway in the story of the George W. Bush presidency, is this embrace of humility. And so when he gets to the financial crisis, he's not the same man. He doesn't have the same bravado. He's not as convinced of his own worldview. He's much more willing to listen to technocrats and people who understand this. And he's more willing to deviate from what is expected of a conservative president and to pump money into the markets. And this ultimately rescues our economy. So I think he does go out on this note of real kind of growth in his presidency.
Susan, is there anything surprising that you learned about George W. Bush or about his presidency that you didn't know, or that you saw but didn't really see while you were working on this?
Yeah, I think there were two things that surprised me a little bit. One of them isn't really a surprise, because so many of our presidents do evolve and mature over the course of their presidency, and I don't think I was as intimately aware of the ways in which Bush did. And so that was revealing to me. But I think the other thing that was revealing to me was that he was a man who did have his own very effective political instincts, that we think of him as somebody who simply followed in his father's footsteps and really just had, that wind behind his back. But when he finally did step out into the limelight, into the political world on his own, what we interpreted as being sort of the inarticulate buffoon charmed a great portion of the American public. And he tapped into something. And I think he did that far more self-aware of its value and being, a part of who he was, and it served him well. And so that was an interesting revelation for me.
How about you, Barak?
Well, I couldn't agree more with Susan on that. I'm privileged to have done these biographies on two of the greatest sort of person-to-person politicians in American history. I mean, as great as Bill Clinton was, and he's famous for every time he talks to you, you think you're the only person in the room. George W. Bush had similar skills, and I agree with Susan that was a great surprise. I was also, like all of us, sort of affected by the stereotypes of George W. Bush, and found, in an interesting way, challenged on those stereotypes, that he was much more intelligent, much more kind of decisive and strong in office than I had understood. That didn't mean that he didn't have problems with disengagement from detail and delegating important things. He did all those things. But when it came to deciding big issues, there was no question about who was in charge. This was not a puppet on a string or some kind of foil for, Dick Cheney. This was a man who everyone knew was in charge, and who people had to calculate how to persuade to their point of view. But there was no question that he was going to make the decision. So that was a very big surprise to me, and opened up all sorts of interesting avenues of investigation for us as filmmakers.
Great. Susan, what's up next? I know we're going to watch this on May 4th and watch it as a two-part series, but what's in the pipeline for American Experience?
May 4th and May 5th.
Right.
We also have a wonderful, interesting film next week after Bush called Mr. Tornado, about the man behind the F scale that we now measure tornado strength with. But we have a really important and timely series coming up called The Vote, which will commemorate the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the fight to earn women the right to vote.
This sounds amazing. So are you both really great at presidential trivia? I mean, I know we're kind of sitting at home now, and there are probably some online games. I just want to know if you're playing any, so I can make sure I avoid playing against either one of you. Right? I mean, do you keep this information? I mean, that's the serious part of the question is, or do you keep it and dump it, or do you keep it and file it? Where's it all go?
It gets pushed out.
The whole reason we do what we do is because we're good at digging in and then forgetting and moving on. So I can't. I would not be a good partner in Trivial Pursuit.
Yeah.
Susan,
we're about the big picture.
Big picture.
We're storytellers. We're not about the facts. We're about creating a story out of the past. So.
Well, thanks so much to both of you for taking time out to join us. We direct folks on May 4th and May 5th, George W. Bush. It's the latest from the American Experiences presidential series. It's the 17th. And again, listen, there's no reason for you not to watch it, and it's a great opportunity I have found if you're home with your teens or your young adults. They really don't want to hear you talking about your experiences. They'd rather watch these great storytelling, fact-based programs. So I encourage everyone to watch it. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Remind folks that you can watch us again here anytime. It's Lunch Hour Live. We're going to continue to bring you the best sort of highlights of what we can to keep you invested and engaged. Stay safe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.